This weekend is Thanksgiving weekend in the United States. When today's episode goes live, Chuckles and I will be arriving back home from a trip out of town to see family. Because of this episode will be shorter than normal, so I hope you'll understand. Have a wonderful holiday weekend and stay safe. Now it's time for the show.
Pot Stir Podcast, where politics, religion, and history collide, and it's not always polite.
My high school was a small Roman Catholic all-girls school. My parents put me in Catholic schools in part to keep me safe, as they perceived the Detroit public schools as being dangerous. Considering the way people talked about my neighborhood public high school and the news stories, I could see why my parents were concerned. We had very few male teachers at the school. One was Mr. LaCalamita. He was one of the math teachers. He was only there 1 year during my sophomore year. I never had him for a class since I was taking math with juniors, but he taught a lot of my classmates. He was relatively young, late 20s-ish. The rumor was that he had gone to seminary to be a priest, but then decided to pursue teaching instead of the priesthood. I remember him because around this time, the Fugees came out with the song Guantanamera, so some of my classmates would sub in his name for the song chorus. La Calamita. I interacted with him sometimes, but not super often. He was pretty quiet and reserved, but he was okay from what I recall. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. I took time off from grad school right after my dad died, and I spent a year living at home helping my mom with my younger brother, who was a teenager at the time. I worked as an adjunct instructor, and to help make ends meet, I also took a contract job as a substitute teacher in one of the local suburban school districts. One day, I was working as a sub in a high school, and during an open period, I picked up a copy of the local paper. On the front page was a story about an accountant being tried in county court for murder and attempted murder. According to the story, the accountant had been fired from his job, and he later came back with a 12-gauge shotgun, shot the office manager to death, then shot at the other members of the firm. The detail that really stuck out to me is that the accused killer walked into the office of one of the partners, then asked the partner, "Would you like to be shot?" before shooting him. He went on a high-speed chase before police apprehended him. The other detail that stuck out to me was the killer's name, Anthony LaCalamita III. That name sounded familiar. I remembered a teacher at my high school named Anthony LaCalamita. Could it really be the same person? I looked at the picture, and it sure looked like him, but I wasn't sure. This guy was an accountant, not a teacher. So when I went home, I read more into the story of Anthony LaCalamita III. And come to find out, he was the same person, Mr. LaCalamita. Apparently, the priesthood story was true. He had gone from the priesthood to teaching. He taught at my high school, then later taught at another local all-girls school. He then moved on from teaching and used his math skills to become an accountant. I won't go through the details here because I'm sure you don't listen to me for true crime stories, but it's really a fascinating story and it's worth reading about if you're interested in true crime. Anthony LaCalamita III was later convicted of the charges and sentenced to mandatory life in prison. When I think about the issue of crime, I always remember the fact that we never know who could turn out to do bad things. It's not always the bad guy in a mask or a terrorist in a grainy video with scrolling Arabic. Most of the time, it's the people we interact with daily. It can be a family member, a friend, the neighbor. Sometimes it's the high school math teacher you trust with their children. I am your host, Jaye. The Orlando nightclub shooting in June 2016 killed 49 people. The Las Vegas concert shooting October 1st of this year killed 58 people, and the latest, the Sutherland Springs, Texas shooting November 5th, killed 26 people. 3 of the 5 deadliest mass shootings in the United States have occurred within the last year and a half. Yet all our officials have to offer for most of these mass shootings are thoughts and prayers, and are short on leadership. We live in a country with some of the highest levels of gun violence, yet our leaders refuse to do anything about it. Many of our politicians state that we can't do anything about it because of the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Second Amendment states this: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is one of the few issues where I lean more right of center. I strongly believe that the government should not have the exclusive right to own weapons, including guns. But a lot of people don't understand why the Second Amendment is important. It's important for a couple of reasons. The United States is a very vast country. There are still a lot of places where people live in the United States that are remote, where if you're in real danger, you can't expect to just call 911 and have your local police show up right away. There are even many cities that do not have the quick emergency response needed to realistically have citizens depend on them for protection. That can be because, for example, in Cincinnati, there are parts of the city of Cincinnati that are far away from the nearest police station, and if you call 911, you may not see help show up for a while. And in other cities, police forces may be corrupt and cannot be trusted by their citizens. The other reason is that the Second Amendment is designed for government to have accountability towards its citizens. One of the influences on the U.S. Constitution was the English Bill of Rights, which was an act of Parliament guaranteeing certain rights of English subjects from the Crown, written in the 1600s. This was one of the documents leading up to parliamentary sovereignty, written in Joyce today. In the Commentaries on the Laws of England, written in 1765, Sir William Blackstone wrote, "The fifth and last auxiliary right of the subject that I shall at present mention is that of having arms for the defense, suitable to their condition and degree, and such as are allowed by law," which is also declared by the same statute. 1 William and Mary, Section 2, Clause 2, and is indeed a public allowance under due restrictions of the natural right of resistance and self-preservation when the sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression. So my reasons for supporting the Second Amendment come down to the fact that the government cannot be trusted. And if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you can find plenty of reasons why. But there's a difference between trusting government and believing it has a responsibility for the protection and welfare of its citizens. Despite my views about the Second Amendment, you will not see me support the NRA, get involved in the gun lobby, or have Second Amendment issues be my top reason to support a candidate for public office. The reason is that much of the politics of Second Amendment support have very little to do with the reasons the Second Amendment is essential, and a lot more to do with a culture of fear, especially fear of the other. After newsworthy violent events, particularly when the perpetrator is a Caucasian male that is not a member of a minority religion, many right-wing Second Amendment advocates tend to speak to the perpetrator's mental health issues instead of increased gun control. And remember, we do not categorize all violence this way. Donald Trump coasted into the White House with the support of right-wing groups like the NRA by calling Mexicans rapists and criminals as part of his justification for building a southern border wall, pushing a Muslim travel ban to prevent radical Islamic terrorism, and using Chicago as a dog whistle when talking about urban violence, focusing on this one city to push a false narrative that crime is going up and black people have nothing to be concerned about but each other. Yet the fact is that most crime, even among whites, is perpetrated by people within one's own race, and disproportionately by people they know. Even otherwise reasonable people who think of themselves as open-minded can easily associate bad things with the other and not see how the greatest threats can look, speak, live, and think like ourselves. And politicians get voted into office that focus on taking rights away from the scary other while making you and your family no more safe than you were in the first place. So what can be done about gun violence? I have 3 suggestions that can help with gun violence. First, we can strengthen and enforce the laws we already have. The gunman in the Sutherland Springs shooting had a domestic violence conviction from being in the military. This should have kept him from legally obtaining a gun, but it did not. We have the technology to connect these different systems and make background checks more accurate. Our politicians and civil servants just need the will and resources to make these improvements. Second, we can improve how we treat mental health in this country, both in terms of resources and how we view people who are mentally ill. We need to remember that mental illness is common, yet most people who are mentally ill are not violent, nor go on to commit horrific acts. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, 1 in 5 American adults experience mental illness in a given year, and approximately 9.8 million adults a year experience a serious mental illness that substantially interferes with or limits life activities. 1 in 5 teens aged 13 to 18 experience a severe mental disorder at some point during their life, and among the 20.8 million adults with substance abuse issues, half have had a co-occurring mental illness. Yet only 41% of adults and just over 50% of children with mental health conditions receive treatment. So likely you or someone you know has suffered from mental illness, but it's not always easy to find affordable treatment, and even when treatment is accessible, some do not take it because of the stigma surrounding mental illness in this country. Back in the 1980s, the Reagan administration pushed for steep cuts in mental hospitals and mental health services, which has led to a decrease in access to services over the decades. And the Republican Party, in supporting deep cuts to healthcare, is taking away access to healthcare from those who need it most, including people who are mentally ill. Mental health is a life or death issue. According to the NAMI, Americans who are mentally ill have a life expectancy 25 years shorter than the average, primarily due to treatable medical conditions. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, 3rd among 10 to 14-year-olds, and 2nd among people aged 15 to 24. And over 90% of children who die by suicide have a mental health condition. Every day, an average of 18 to 22 veterans die by suicide. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 2/3 of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. There is some link between mass shootings and mental illness, and politicians who blame mass shootings and gun violence on mental health should be serious about actually doing something about mental health, not just simply using it as a catchphrase or something to say to distract from gun control. But we need to remember that of those who are mentally ill, few are violent offenders, and not all violent offenders are mentally ill. Which brings me to my final suggestion. We need to recognize that extremism and violence is not exclusive to religious, ethnic, and racial minorities. It's not the domain of Muslims or Latinos or Black Americans or any other group you want to say is not like us. Donald Trump and his sycophants talk about cracking down on MS-13 and gangland violence in Southside Chicago, where few of them have even stepped foot, while only offering thoughts and prayers for the shootings in Las Vegas. When TV pundits and radio personalities talk about radical Islamic terror, they talk about young Muslims being radicalized by groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Yet the same language of terrorism, extremism, and radicalization is not used to discuss white supremacist terrorist Dylan Roof being radicalized by reading propaganda on the internet posted by the Council of Conservative Citizens before killing 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, or neo-Nazi terrorist James Alex Fields Jr. being radicalized and then driving from northern Ohio to Charlottesville, Virginia, and then killing Heather Heyer and injuring several others by running them over with his Dodge Challenger. We call them lone wolves or deranged, but not terrorists. We have otherized terrorism and violence so much that we believe it when folks like Donald Trump say violence, including gun violence, has gone up when statistically it has gone down. Or when he talks about dangerous radical Islamic terror but ignores the radicalization and white supremacist terror here at home that is more common and a more dangerous threat than Islamic terror. We are manipulated by our political leaders to believe that radical white nationalist ideology is a free speech issue, while radical Islamic ideology is a national security issue. Many Americans worry about madrasas and mosques, women wearing hijab, and the fear of Sharia law spreading in American communities, but we accept political and social institutions, including our churches, accepting white nationalism because the idea of racial and ethnic equality is too liberal commie, or radicalizing young men and women into viewing inequality, gender oppression, sexual predation, and domestic violence as God's design. The double standard by which we treat terrorism and violence in the United States does us all a disservice, because it oppresses some Americans while leaving other Americans with a perception of safety that is only an illusion. It divides us, takes away our liberty, and harms our democracy for no good reason. So many people here in America move away from the other and support building walls, kicking out and cracking down on law-abiding people because some might not look like you, speak like you, or worship like you. But don't forget, the very walls you put up to keep the other out are the same walls you use to lock the danger in. Check out our website today, potstirrerpodcast.com, for previous episodes, special presentations, announcements, merch, and all things Pot Stirrer Podcast. You can find our show on iTunes, Google Play, and most other podcatchers. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, give us 5 stars, leave a review, share, and tell your friends. Thank you for listening and supporting Pot Stirrer Podcast. I'm Jaye Poole. Let's fight for America's future because freedom is not free.